Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our Leading Through Transition discussion today. My name is Kendall Rawls, and I am the Director of Development for the Rawls Group. This is me. And your host for today's panel. We have received many great questions, so we're going to dive in fast to ensure we get to them all. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. First, we have Dan Schneider. Dan Schneider helps family businesses and privately held companies design, build, and activate personal and organizational cultures that impact lives and perpetuate legacies. His CXO experience in manufacturing, technology, financial, and advertising firms provides a rich background for coaching and mentoring others as they accomplish their personal and professional objectives. Next, we have Dan Iosu. And Dan, as a succession planner, Dan Iosu leverages his more than a decade of experience in corporate leadership, working with clients to help them achieve their long-term business goals. Dan works with business owners and key executives to overcome challenges that impact business success, keeping them focused on sustainability and growth. Next, we have Brigitta Hufele. Brigitta is the CEO of the NLP Center of Atlanta. Brigitta is known to be the most fast-tracked female trainer and former lead coach for the biggest self-development company in the world. She has been invited to lead from stage in the art of listening and communicating based on the methodology of neuro-linguistic programming. Brigitta shares success patterns, insights, and strategies for a successful life. Her expertise in communication and education methodologies and her tireless ability to implement new and proven strategies make her the caring leader and mentor that she is to so many people, regionally and globally. And then we also have Amy LeBrake Allen. Amy has a passion for helping individuals, teams, and organizations realize their growth potential. She has more than 20 years experience designing marketing and growth strategies, facilitating leadership workshops, and coaching. Her experience includes working for a top 20 US CPA firm, a national management consulting firm, and providing consulting services to clients in the dealership, accounting, business family succession, retail oil, and propane, and franchise industries. Amy has her MBA in leadership and serves as an adjunct professor of business management, leadership, marketing, and communications. Thank you all who submitted prior to the conversation today. If you have any questions during the conversation, please feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function, and we will make sure to either answer them here and or if we run out of time for some reason, then we will make sure to get back in touch with you with an answer. So here we go. Amy, how can I make sure clients know I'm present for them, such as questions to ask?
I think that's a great question. I think leaders are having to move into a different kind of leadership style today than what they're used to. So I think for their people to understand and know that they're present for them, communication is key. And I can't emphasize that enough. We tend to forget about how important communication is when we're in a remote environment, or even if we're together but going through some additional anxieties or stress. And I think a big piece of that is being present for your people. It's and making sure you're being empathetic and understanding to what we're all going through and that they're not isolated and alone. So I think being present, being at the forefront is a big piece of it, being outwardly focused on your communications and engaging your people. And I think one big thing also is remembering to bring humor and fun into it. You know, we're all going through a lot of anxiety and stress right now. So I think being present, you cannot over communicate, and of course, employing empathy as much as you can.
Great, thanks. So this one's for you again, Amy. How do I build a new routine while working from home without losing productivity from my team?
That's a good one. So I'm a remote worker, and I have been the majority of my career. And what I found going through this actually is that I had to build a new routine for myself. So I think regardless of where you are, whether you're new to remote work or you're like me, an experienced professional in it, building that routine is critical. So one of the things that I recommend to a lot of the people that I'm coaching is to leverage your calendar more than you ever have. So scheduling that time out so that you're including time, like exercise for me is big in the morning. So putting that on my calendar so I've got that time and space for myself, so I'm not scheduling other things that might keep me from taking care of myself. I think stepping away, there are a lot of us that when we work remote, we tend to overwork, or we feel like we have to overdo because we're not face to face with our colleagues or our boss. So I think that making sure that you schedule some time to take a step away is also critical in these times. And I think just making sure that remembering that the routines are going to be different. So allowing yourself space and time to say, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be exactly the way it was. And trying to really work around that. And I think in communicating to your people as leaders, we've got to encourage them to create new and different routines. We have to remember that at home, we've probably got a lot more distractions going on. Mine are about the same because I'm used to it. But for those of us that are new to remote work, you've got kids, you've got pets, you've got spouses, you've got all this other stuff going on top of all this anxiety and stress. So I think just remembering to, one, take care of self and build that routine in, and time and space to make sure that if you're a leader, especially, you're putting a reminder on your calendar to reach out and talk to your team, or even just to check in and say hello. But really being intentional about leveraging your calendar, find an app, anything that you can do there to just create those reminders for you so you're not relying on your own self.
Awesome, thank you. Dan, how do we keep our employee and customer data secure, allowing people to work from home? Dan Schneider.
That would, you know, and that will be true whether you are outsourcing your IT functions or whether you're insourcing them, in-housing them. And the first thing that really becomes important, the first of the 6 steps, is to make sure you have a cybersecurity policy and that people know what it is. Because there are an awful lot of people even today who don't understand the real value of your customer or your client data. So in some fashion, you need to communicate that with people. If it's your practice to have people sign policies or to sign handouts related to policy statements, then probably it's a good idea to have them sign them. And even in those days that will come again, when not everybody will be working from home, it will still be a good idea to have a cybersecurity policy. The second step is to ensure that all of the internet connections are secure. And here again is where you're probably going to have to depend on your IT person to make sure that that happens. The third step is to keep your passwords strong and varied. And if you've ever watched any older movies, you know that when people walked up and there would be a guard somewhere, they'd say, "Halt, who goes there and what's the password of the day?" So it's probably a pretty good idea, not necessarily to have a password of the day, but at least to change the passwords periodically and to make sure that they're strong. A fourth step that I would suggest you take is to use at least 2-factor authentication, so that when people log in, they also have to answer another set of questions before they can actually begin to access the data. While people may steal passwords, it's not often that they're also able to steal the second step in the authentication process. And if you're really concerned about it, then you could even go to a multi-factor. You could go to a 3 or 4 level authentication process. The fifth is probably to use encryption software. And Office and Adobe are examples of software that's fairly common that allows you to encrypt data before you start to share it with other people or you give other people access to it. And then the 6th step would be to update your firewalls to make sure that your antivirus and your anti-malware software is current and up to date. And I would encourage you to do that on all of the devices that people may be using as they work from home. So that would include phones as well as laptops or desktop computers and things of that type. And that will help you safeguard the security of your data.
Thank you, Dan. Amy, how do personality styles play into productivity and communication?
Oh, that's a good one. I think that's something we as leaders often overlook when we're thinking about our people, especially when we're in the remote environment. So when we're all together, you can kind of get a sense of, how people are reacting to certain situations, or how they're taking a communication, or how they're engaging in a meeting. And where we tend to forget is that there are personalities at play. And for instance, I'm an introvert. I love to speak publicly, but that does not mean I'm an extrovert, but I'm an introvert. So I need time to kind of reflect. And I do very well working from home or working behind the screen. I don't mind being a hermit. So I don't need as much social interaction or engagement, whereas an extrovert is going to need a lot more of that. So in this new normal of remote work, those extroverts that might be on your team, you have to be more mindful of the fact that they don't have that social interaction, so their energy draw might be a little bit more. So for extroverts, it might mean reaching out a little bit more, or finding ways on that team to create more of that interaction. And on the adverse, for us introverts, now all of a sudden we're finding ourselves in environments where we're probably having more outward interaction with our teammates via Zoom, via other meeting platforms, having to be on video, whereas before in the office, you might be able to just stay, a little bit behind the scenes. So it's just remembering what different personalities need in terms of their engaging or social energy, as well as communication style. Once we get behind the screen and everything's digital and we're doing it via email or text or message, we in ourselves will interpret things based on our personality style, and we forget about the person that's sending it. So it's really important sometimes in those communications, especially ones in conflict, to take a step back and say to yourself, is this about me or is it about them? And think about what the desired response is. And the same thing when you're sending, it's like, what do I need to get my job done today? And make sure you're crafting the email in a way that the other person is going to respond. So it's just, in this new normal, it's taking a step back and remembering we all don't act the same, we all don't think the same, and we all need different things to kind of keep us energized throughout the day.
And Amy, as you're talking, it occurred to me that in reference to being extroverted or introverted, I'm literally right on the line in that, I really enjoy talking and associated with other people, but I tend to get my energy recharged from being a little more introverted. And what I've found over the past couple of weeks is that I'm more inclined to, withdrawal is not really the right word, but sort of step back if I'm not in an environment where I'm actively engaged with people, like in an office or traveling to see clients. And so one of the things that I've discovered that I need to do personally is create sort of a to-do list for myself to step over the line towards being a little more extroverted, because that keeps me in the flow, if you will. So I think self-awareness is a critical piece of that as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Dan, especially when we think about a lot of the professionals that do travel a lot for client work or doing a lot for team collaborations. I think self-awareness is a very big piece of that, for sure.
Great, guys. Thank you so much. Brigitta, how do we build muscle memory to support our culture and new habits that actually stick?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Kendall, for having me on. How do you build muscle memory to support our culture? Well, first of all, if you want to build muscle memory, you gotta be very clear on what do you want the muscle to remember. So being very specific what your outcome is as a leader and as team members, what you want your culture to be, what you want the mission of your culture to be, and then creating those habits and having ownership of the team and of the leaders that will consistently do what is laid out to create that muscle memory. Now, in order for us to remember anything, and where the brain has gone before, or the mind has gone before, it's easy to go there again, but it must have all three representational systems: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. So you must be able to imagine it, you must be able to vividly hear it and listen for it, and you must connect the feeling to it. If it's only just one, you're never going to really create something that's going to stick. And if you're not doing it over and over again, and there's not an ownership and a buy-in from the team, it's not going to stick either. So there are several components to establishing this new culture in this new normal, in this new economy. You always got to in NLP, we say you got to calibrate to the new behavior. You got to look for clues in the new behavior and then readjust. So being flexible in that is also a big piece.
Great, thank you. Dan, can you share some best practices for keeping team members who are less busy than normal engaged to reduce boredom? For example, in a dealership, those in parts, service, and sales, or perhaps in a manufacturing organization, those in the same areas, parts, service, or sales.
Sure. I think that there are practices that I found worked well for me. That doesn't necessarily make them best practices. It's just practices that I found that worked well. And whenever we were a little slow in terms of what was going on in any of the organizations I was involved in, then one of the questions I would usually walk around and talk to people and ask them is, what are the 3 most important things you can do today that will advance our culture and advance the way that we deliver products and services to our clients? And I would let them tell me what the 3 things were that they thought they could do that would be contribute the most value to how the organization, to how they would work on that particular day. And then I'd say, great, go do it. And then if you run out of those 3 and you get them all done today, then start on 3 for tomorrow and just, keep going forward. And sometimes I would also ask them, what's the most important question that I can ask you today? And that would give me an opportunity to find out from them what it was that they thought either was on their minds about what was going on with the current level of working conditions, or how they were feeling. And that was a good way to begin the communications process with them. And if they told me that they didn't know what the most important question I could ask them that day was, I would usually respond was, well, if you did know, what would it be? And generally, that gave them an opportunity to come back, and they began to think about it. So I think the biggest thing you can do to keep people productive is to ask them what they think they should be doing and then tell them to go do it. So
Great.
that's, and maybe some others on the panel have had some experience or have some different thoughts about that.
Yeah, I guess I would add, Dan, I think in the remote environment, it does pose a little bit of a challenge for some people that might need a little more push. So for some of us out there that are leading teams, we also have to be putting in front of them something we think they should be doing too, so that they're not left feeling, well, what am I supposed to be doing? So I think in the remote world, we have to identify when they might need that little nudge and give them a carrot, for lack of a better way of saying it.
For those employees that are in different stages of stress and potentially grief, Dan Osu, what are some ideas to best support them?
Well, it's a good question, Kendall. I think the answer is actually in the question, in that so it's about supporting your employees first. Brigitta, as an expert in NLP, can relate to this in that I love universal truths. And I think that there's a universal truth here in that we're all experiencing various levels of stress and emotions from the same thing at the same time. And that's certainly unique in my lifetime, and I think my parents' lifetimes as well. And so, and I think the stress taps into, these primal part of ourselves, in that it's, taps directly into fight, flight, or fear. And for a lot of us, we're not able to potentially not able to make that choice. Some of us are forced to freeze because we're sequestering and under quarantine, and others are forced to fight by first responders or medical professionals, people working in grocery stores. I mean, they've got to get out and do their jobs. And so, point being, we're all experiencing various levels of stress and fear, and in some cases joy at some of the little things that we've come to recognize and be grateful for. in being at home, potentially with our families. And so a way to best support employees would be to, as Amy said earlier, approach it from the perspective of being as empathetic as possible, and working to understand that your people are where they're at right now, and they are working to process according to the best of their capabilities. And so I would operate with a stewardship sense of responsibility, put your people first, to empathize wherever possible, give them the benefit of the doubt whenever possible. And also, hey, we've all got a job to do, and we've got to find a way to be productive, to do business, and to get the job done. So there's time and place for various stages of processing and handling, but we also have to keep in mind that it is about performance, and that there's a time to demand that we deliver.
Thank you, Dan. So what we're going through now will potentially have changes in the business environment long term. So Dan Schneider, can you share some thoughts on what you feel some of those long-term changes may be? And a specific question we got from the field too, it was a dealer, and they were curious and wondered what you think it may look like from a dealership perspective once it's over. Or once this is over.
Okay. Well, allow me to put the crystal ball in front of me here and try to tell you what the future is going to look like. That's, and I'm often wrong, but I'm seldom in doubt about a lot of things. But the future is something I do have a lot of doubt about. So I don't really know what the future is going to look like, except that it probably will not look a great deal like the past. So part of what people are going to have to take into consideration as they go through this is that from a business environment standpoint, I would encourage you not to expect an immediate snapback. I mean, this is not a rubber banding of the economy where things have compressed and then all of a sudden it's going to be under tremendous pressures to be stretched again. It's probably going to take a period of time, and there will be some readjustments that you and people have to become accustomed to. I think one of the things you should expect is that in my experience, regardless of whatever the circumstances are, work tends to contract or expand based on whatever the time is available and how much work there is to get done. So part of what you may want to focus on is how do you keep people productively involved, and in times that might appear initially to be downtime, that could be an excellent opportunity to help them with their personal and professional development. And one of the things about the programs that you would work on, that I would encourage you to work on, are things that are portable so that they could be used either at home in their personal lives or on the job in their professional life. I think you should expect that customers, some of the clients, especially in a dealership, just because they have been in a self-imposed or government-imposed isolation for a period of time, may actually want to take a little longer in your showroom than they have up until now, just because in the first few weeks, they want some people contact again. So they may take a little longer as they're in your showrooms. Another piece that you probably should expect is that given the financial condition that most of the people in the United States find themselves in, and maybe around the world, is that it's estimated that 75% of the US population has less than a couple of weeks worth of savings that they can use to help them. So you should expect that there could be some dramatic changes in some of the credit ratings that you've been looking at for some of your customers. And over time, they may go down because people are going to have tapped out some of their credit cards, or they may have taken some loans, and they're probably still going to be living from paycheck to paycheck. The only difference will be that the paycheck they need is still 2 or 3 paychecks away to begin to get caught up. So I would expect that the credit ratings for some of your clients are probably going to be quite a bit different than they may have been up to this point. I think from the standpoint of what happens in the way that you do business is that it's going to be really important to get in close to your clients and to make sure that you're talking their language. We've talked a lot about communication. And you should expect that unless they really feel that you have a great deal of empathy, then they're going to go find somebody who does. And there are a couple of phrases that probably would not be wise to use. And one of those is if a potential client starts telling you about the circumstances that she or he currently finds themselves in, don't tell them that you understand unless you've truly been there, because you have no way of knowing what they really, of understanding what their particular circumstances are. You can empathize with them and say, boy, that must feel terrible. I know it would put me, I would not feel particularly good about that. But unless you've really been there, don't tell them that you understand them. So I think that your relationship skills are going to be particularly important. I think another thing that you may find that's going to impact the business environment is that you may discover that working from home actually works, and that you no longer have to make some of the investment that you've made in bricks and mortar up to this point. And if picking up on some of the things that Amy mentioned in the response about how do you keep people busy, then the ways that you do communicate to them what the purpose of their job is and what the expectations are related to that purpose are going to be truly important. Otherwise, there will be some people who drift a little bit as they try to figure out what they should be doing. And it won't be because, excuse me, it won't be because they're scofflaws. It'll be because they don't really know what they should be doing. So, and for some of us, absent a kind of a recipe of this is what we should be doing and this is the order in which we should be doing it, they're going to get stuck. So part of the leadership challenge in the environment is to make sure that people don't get stuck in trying to meet your expectations. So I think those are some going to be some of the more profound changes that you actually see in the environment. And anybody who wants to add to that is welcome to.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think specifically on the dealership side, we have to remember that it wasn't too long ago that dealerships were coming out of something pretty tragic. You know, remember 2008. So I think dealers have a really great opportunity to allow for, or I should say, share some of their expertise and remember back, you know, what they were going through a few years ago. And what we saw that came out of that was a lot of innovation and a lot more appreciation and customer touches. So I think it's a great opportunity for dealers, specifically to the question from the dealer, is look at ways to be more community minded and touching your potential customers and your current customers, and use it as an opportunity to bring people together. So as Dan said, it might take longer for a customer in the showroom, or even the sales cycle might take longer, but think of what you can do from a community event perspective, or how you can bring your people together and really celebrate when we all come out of isolation, how, you know, you can make that sales process and the relationship a little bit better and, you know, more rewarding to the customer.
Yeah, Amy, do you think, and Brigitta or Dan, do you think that there's any possibility that the trust that people have in a retail environment, the customers in a retail environment, might typically have is going to be damaged in some ways just because there has been this period of isolation? And will we have to learn how to retrust each other?
That's a great question, Dan. I think from the retail environment, I venture to guess, again, I don't have a crystal ball like you. I would venture to guess retail, probably not as much trust loss, just because our retailers are doing so much right now and putting their people on the front lines to keep our economy going. But I think that social interaction, I think the handshakes, the being in close proximity, the test drives in a car environment, or those other retailers that really have to have that social or physical connection with the customer, I think the trust might be lost there a little bit.
I agree, and I would add to that the more you can do right now to stay in touch with your customer, that the shorter the period is to gain that trust back. So anything that you can do on top of what you're doing right now as a dealer in retail, whatever it is that you're doing, stay in touch with your customers, take care of them, check in on them, be there for them, have Zoom calls with them, you know, shout them out on Facebook, whatever it is. It's just the small touches is going to shorten that trust building period again.
Yeah, and if there's one thing that I think we probably agree on, it's that, you know, rebuilding that trust or building trust in general is going to certainly look different on the other side of this than beforehand. Yeah, but one of the advantages that that exists is that depending on where you are in the country and potentially other areas of the world, there's going to be a rollout in various stages, I think, of getting back to whatever the new normal is as we come out of isolation. And so I would, as a leader, look to see what's happening kind of out in front in areas that have gone through it on the earlier end and are coming out of it on the earlier end, and seeing what some of the common practices and pitfalls are there, and work to implement them in my own business.
One of our partners, Hugh Roberts, just did a video focused on it's a great time to expand your business family or your family business, and just talked about how to reach out and be there for your people, your partners, and your community. And I do think, just to add a little bit to the conversation, what organizations do now, and as a business owner, you have the opportunity to be a leader in the community. Your customers, your partners, and your employees are going to remember what you did in this time period in the future. And so anything that you can do to call, like Brigitta said, how are you doing? Simply, how are you doing? Or whatever your messaging is through commercials or social media, for it to be very nurturing, centered. We are here for you, and we're doing everything we can to support you. The community will remember that, and the community being your employees and partners and customers.
I think that's a great point. And I've got locally here in New Hampshire, we've got a lot of course, I'm sure it's nationwide, the restaurants are really, really struggling. And we've got a family-owned restaurant that is closed down. They're doing takeout and delivery, but what they've started to do in an innovation, perspective is they've started reaching out to local communities to actually do delivery that's outside of their local area. And then they've also added to that means of like, okay, well, if you order this particular product, we're going to donate all the proceeds from that meal or that food or whatever to a given charity. And they're changing their charities out. And they're doing it on behalf of the company, their restaurant, and their employees. So to what you were saying with Hugh's video, it's important because that is exactly what the community and the employees are absolutely going to remember, as well as the charities. I mean, I think, servant leadership is what we say, right?
Absolutely. So this is a great segue to the next question that we just got. Brigitta, how will the new normal, again, looking into the crystal ball, how do you believe that's going to affect business culture, our culture, just as, I guess, humans on this earth, to Dan's point in terms of trust and connectivity? And what do you think the work landscape will look like?
Yeah, so let me look into the future, and everything's up in the air, right? And it's what we do with it. Let me give you the analogy that I brought in a webinar that I did last week about water. So imagine you are creating out of ice, you're creating a beautiful Pegasus sculpture, okay? That is a very set in stone sculpture, or set in ice sculpture, that is very rigid. And the only way that it will lose its sculpture is, or its form is, either it's going to break or it's going to melt. So let's go with the melting. Once it melts, that ice, which is very rigid and very in place, is now very fluid. It becomes water. So now with that water, we get to do all sorts of things. We can heat it up and it goes into steam. We can actually freeze it again and create our new normal and create a whole new sculpture out of it. So it's up to us with how much flexibility are we looking at the opportunities that are out there and creating the new normal. What do I want to create? What do I want it to look like as a leader in my company? What do I want to have this new culture to look like as a company owner? What do I want this to look like? And become very clear, as I said earlier, where do I want to drive towards to? What is the new normal? What do I want the new normal in a perfect world to be? And then have ownership of the others, and then create this new sculpture of something that was already there. So we're reactivating and we're reinventing as we move forward, and that is a denominalization. So we're continuing to move forward with that, reactivating and reinventing. Now, what will the work landscape look like? Let's use that water analogy, and let's add a seed to it. We are planting new seeds, and maybe we are watering the old plants that has brought in new seeds, and creating something that has deeper roots, that we have learned from some of the mistakes, as Amy said. Some of the dealerships probably have learned from 2008 and put a little bit more money aside. And if not yet, maybe that is a learning opportunity for this now. I heard that Taiwan has immediately, kind of switched back to normal, because they already went through such pandemic before with SARS, and they learned so much from it, that corporations immediately had an emergency plan in place, and they just switched back to normal pretty quick. So this is also an opportunity for us to learn from what was happening, what was going on, and choose to, as we move forward, implement some great strategies of what we have learned from this crisis and from this pandemic.
Thanks, Brigitta. Just to add a little bit to what you said, in a prior conversation, I think it was navigating the unknown, a similar question came up for Lloyd, and he had talked about making sure that you're documenting all the new processes that you're putting in place now. So the next time there is a pandemic, the next time there is a crisis, just like you said with Taiwan, they've already gone through it and used this time. So you don't, if you don't learn something new during this time, then you haven't used it effectively. So.
Yeah, agreed.
That's true. I mean, in marketing, we've always had crisis communication manuals. So why wouldn't we have one for crisis operations? It makes a whole lot of sense.
So Dana Osu, with furloughs and pay decreases happening in order to maintain payroll and paychecks, but maybe just decreasing what someone may be receiving. How will the financial distress some of these people feel affect their motivation, and what are some insights that you have to help overcome some of those negative feelings that may occur?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I think, in my experience, financial distress, taps into all sorts of different emotions that can be difficult to overcome. And, in this case, I would say that I don't know of anyone personally or professionally that hasn't been impacted in some way, financially, by what's happening. And of course, that's compounded by the uncertainty of when things will turn around. So I think financial stress can certainly be a demotivator. And I think a lot of people are looking for reassurance that they're going to be okay. Things might not be okay, but ultimately they'll be okay on the other side of this, for one. And as a leader, I'm looking to other areas of motivation, like the need to bond with other people, which is also challenged now, and our team environments are virtual. So I would emphasize placing an even higher value, if you don't already place a high value on teamwork. I would emphasize working together, sharing best practices among your teams, and whether that's, Skype calls or, look, individual calls go a long way. Reach out more than you normally do to more people than you normally would, across divisions, across departments. Let's, work to connect the different silos of your organization in order to satisfy and reinforce the need that we all have to bond together and to reinforce our tribes. And to that point, I think we've all got a need to defend our teams or our tribes together. So this, need to defend or protect is also being threatened. And so that can be, I think, reinforced and used as motivation when, you're transparent to the greatest extent possible with your organization and what you're going through. You're transparent in what you're doing. You're transparent in your motivations, and you emphasize fairness in order to build trust, which again reinforces, I think, this drive that people have to defend their own teams. So I think Amy said it earlier. I think we've all kind of said it. Communicate, over communicate, and communicate sincerely. And I think that will help to fill the gaps as best as possible that are being created by the financial stress that most of us are certainly feeling.
If I could build on that for just a second, as Dan was talking, I was thinking that sometimes a lot of the financial stress in particular can lead to a depression. And one of the things that I think that you probably could go back and think about the question where we said, what do you do with people who don't have enough time? Is one of the places that you could also put in place as a business owner or as a business leader who can make a decision like this is, if you do not currently have an employee assistance program, think of putting one in place and sponsor financial responsibility seminars or workshops or something, so that people have an opportunity to talk to experts about, like a Dan Aosu or some of my other colleagues with the Rawls Group, who could really talk to them in terms of, well, there are a couple of things to realize. And number one is, while your 401k may have taken a big hit, you probably were not going to use it all at once anyway. So there's going to be a period of time where you're going to be able to rebuild it, regardless of what your current age happens to be. So, and then also talk to people, some of the stress that will be non-financial, but there may be some family stresses and challenges that come out of this too, because people have been pushed together, and the relationships may not have been that good to start with, or they may have been excellent to start with, and maybe they got better, or maybe they were bad and got worse. But they're going to need some counseling, and they're going to need to talk to some people about how they feel. And while you may be a tremendously empathetic person, in all likelihood, if you're a business owner, unless you're in the counseling business, you're not a counselor. So get in touch with some people who can help you set up employee assistance programs, make some on-site counseling. One of our clients, one that Dan and I happen to share, has, I forget exactly what title he uses, but he uses he's called a company counselor, and he comes in and just, or maybe it's a company cleric or something along those lines. But anyway, he comes in and he just sets up appointments with people and spends time talking to them about what's going on in your life, what do you need some help with, and then he directs them to people who can be of genuine service and real professionals. So those are some of the kinds of things you can do too to help relieve some of that stress.
And Dan, to expound on that a little bit, there are a lot of, I think, there are a lot of professionals who would be willing to help in those areas, just purely to help and to give back in a time where, they might have a difficult time otherwise doing that, and that could provide an avenue for those professionals to give back and help some people out, during this time of need. So there are a lot of resources out there, I think, if you'd look.
Another great segue into the next question. So Dan Schneider, given a scenario where the company has had to make the decision to make pay cuts or furlough, how can a business owner and leader sincerely communicate the steps that they have taken to mitigate the impact to their employees and also impact of the downturn?
One of the things I think that would become important here is, first of all, knowing who your audience is and how you can talk to them. And secondly, make sure that the messages and the way you communicate with what you have done is communicated in such a way that it's all about them and it's not about you. And this is how they're going to be benefited. And so here's some of the steps that we, and not necessarily here are some of the steps that I have taken. Here's some of the steps that collectively we've taken to help each other get through this and to support each other. And one of the things that goes with servant leadership that one of our panelists talked about a little earlier is a certain sense of humility. And being humble doesn't mean you can't tell people what you've done. It just means you have to tell them in such a way that they think it's more about them than it is about you. So part of what will become important in doing that is just saying, here are some of the needs that you told us you had. Here are some of the things that we've been able to do to address those needs. And then ask them for some feedback on how well those needs might have been met, either in a one-off setting, or if you're doing this in a group setting, then you can talk to them in a group setting about that. And the other thing that I think will really become important in telling this, and this is not a Dan Schneider principle, this is a Dale Carnegie principle. And one of Dale Carnegie's principles of winning friends and influencing people is expect ingratitude. And no matter what you have done, for some people it will not have been enough. And that's not a reflection on you, it's a reflection on them. So don't put yourself down because not everybody rushed up and told you how wonderful you were because of the steps and things that you took. And if you, one of the examples that I often use when I talk to people about this kind of reaction to ingratitude is that, and it's particularly appropriate now because it's Easter, but a large portion of the world's population just suffered the resurrection of somebody that many people believe to have been the Son of God. And in the course of his life, then one of the things that he did was meet with these 10 lepers. And these 10 lepers all said, send us out to somebody to cure our leprosy. So he said, well, here's who you need to go see. And he sent them off, and they were about halfway the way to this healer's house, and all of a sudden discovered they no longer had leprosy. And if you're familiar with the story, you know that 9 out of the 10 kept going and celebrated at probably whatever that version of a bar was in those days. They went to the bar and celebrated, and one came back and said, thank you. Now, if the person that many people in the world consider to be the Son of God only got an expression of gratitude from 1 out of 10 people, do you really think you're going to do that much better in terms of how people are going to express their gratitude to you? So just know that what you have done was what you consider to be the right thing to do, and don't be put off if somebody says you should have done more. And just use, again, that sense of this was all about you, it's not about me, and you'll be fine.
So, Brigitta, what's the best way to make decisions in uncertain times?
You know, uncertain times, in times of transitions, we as humans, we get caught up in like an emotional response. I think, Danny, I also said it earlier, we either go into fight or flight or even freeze, and that impacts our brain physiology. And I want to just, again, no crystal ball, but I want to give you guys an exercise. Take a big piece of paper, you know, just any kind of white paper, and draw 2 circles, one big circle on the outside and a big circle on the inside. The circle on the outside is your circle of concern, anything that is outside of your control. So start writing in what you're not in control of. But what I really want you to focus on is what you're putting inside in that circle of influence. That is what you are in control of. And right now, that I want to encourage you to focus on what you are in control of, because everything else, if you try to control everything else that's outside of your control, it's going to add to the frustration. Now we have layers of frustration that's not going to help you. So really going with an exercise that as an exercise like this, and tapping into what is in my control. And you'll be surprised as you start filling in that big circle on the inside, your circle of influence, your circle of what you're in control of. You're going to, as you go through the exercise, you're going to remember more and more things, and you're going to be aware of more and more things that are actually in your control that you can then take action on. Because everything is up in the air right now anyway. So let's look at the things that are possible. Let's look at the opportunities out there and not at all of the challenges. That is a simple reframe. That is easy said, harder to do. And that taps into what both Dan said earlier, and I think it was Amy too, that we need people that we can use as a sounding board, that we can talk to, that we can, kind of just dump our brain to and speak our mind with, which gives you more awareness of what is actually in your control. And the more you are aware of what is in your control and what are the actions that you can take, what's in your control, the less frustrated you're going to be, and the more open you're going to be to the opportunities that are out there for you, and the possibilities as well.
Brigitta, can you give some examples of things that are within our control?
That are within our control?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. So let's look at today. What is in my control? It is in my control that I am on this panel, that I'm continuing to learn. It's in my control that when I get off this panel, that I want to get on another webinar and learn and listen to other people, continue to use the time that I have right here, right now in my office, with having 2 children downstairs that are online schools and 3 neighbor children that are also here that are hanging out because mom and dad have to work and they're trying to figure things out. Those are things that I am in control, that I can be a part of our neighborhood, that I can be a part of giving back, that I can continue to learn, that I can build either my own programs, help other people build their programs, checking in with people. Those are all things, reaching out to people. Those are all things that I am in control of, and where I can be an influencer, be empowering to others. I have the ability to go on Facebook Live and talk about my frustration. That might actually be something that other people need to hear, that they're not the only one that are struggling with this situation. They want to feel and see and hear leaders be vulnerable and go, oh, well, wait a minute, they're facing the exact same things that I'm facing, and they're out there being vulnerable. I think it was Dan Schneider that said it earlier. Humility and vulnerability in our leaders is something that is really going to speak louder than any actions, and that makes them relatable and empathetic. So those are things that are in my control. Things that are outside of my control is, well, why is the government not doing that, and pointing fingers, and why is the employer not taking actions, and asking why altogether is a really bad idea. So if you can stay clear of asking the question why altogether, and look at the how can I do it differently? What can I do today that is in my influence, in my control? And how can I look at what I'm facing right now, the challenges, and look at them in a different way?
I think that's great, Brigitta. I think, going back to the question earlier on routine, I think when you can take a look at where is in our center of control, I think that's a great way to build routine around that. And, we talked about financial stressors and stuff like that earlier. For me, I'm a high stress person I'm a control freak. So things that are outside of my control, I get really worried about. But, you know, one of the things I've been doing is committing to more learning during this downtime and committing to giving more back. You know, we're all donating our time here to help everybody else out there because we're all going through it together, but also different things like I'm not checking the stock market as much as I used to because, you know what, I know my retirement's going to be down. I can't control the stock market, but I can definitely control how often I'm checking the numbers every single day. So, you know, to your point, Brigitta, I think it's like remembering what's in our control. And then going back to the routine question earlier, build those things in that are positive in that, and then take those things out that might create more stressors or make us ask that question, why?
Yeah, love that.
I think the piece that really becomes important here is that while you may not be able to control the stock market, you can control whether or not you're in the stock market. And I think that one of the things that really becomes important from that perspective is that you can control the choices that you make. And if you've chosen to participate in the stock market, then basically you're involved in the world's largest auction house. And when nobody is buying, then prices are going to drop. And that's part of what we're seeing right now is that we're in an auction for investments in lots of companies and nobody wants to buy them. So the prices have fallen dramatically. If it stresses you, then one of the things I guess that I remember, and it's a principle that somewhat comes from what Brigitta would be doing with neuro-linguistic programming, and that's that suffering is pretty much your own option. And if you find yourself suffering over the choices that you've made, don't make those choices anymore. Make some different choices that are going to help you live a richer and fuller life with less stress or distress involved in them. So you can't always control your choices. You may not like the choices that are open to you, but you can always choose which one you take.
Brigitta, do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay. Brigitta has to jump off right at 3 o'clock, which is why I asked. So let me find it. It is, this seems to be a good opportunity to empower people, encourage people to think outside of the box, see what they're made of, and see if they'll step up or not. So what does that really mean and how do we do it?
Yeah, so, you know, empowering is one thing. You cannot motivate people. You can be there, you can love on them, you can care for them, you can check in with them. You can make their life a little bit more, I'm going to call it light. So, you know, what we have said before in this call, checking in with people, being vulnerable yourself and being out there, sharing your own story and how you are dealing with situations and how are you overcoming them will empower other people, because they might be so stuck in their own little forest that they cannot see the trees. So often it's just a quick story of, listen, this is what I'm facing right now. I have a little puppy that's peeing in the house. I have 2 children of my own that are in online school in Zoom rooms the entire day from 9 o'clock to 3:30, and they're about done with Zoom just as much as we are done. Then on top of that, I have the neighbors' kids here, and everyone is looking at me because, hey, Brigitta can juggle chainsaws. So really being out there and just telling people, these are my struggles, and here's how I'm dealing with them. I'm still, you know, I wake up, I have a smile on my face, and I'm with a can-do attitude, and let's go do it. I think that just real life scenarios going out and allowing people to see that as leaders, that we're facing just the same way like everyone else will, and then giving them what you do as an opportunity and not as a stuckness is going to empower people. Then on top of that, you know, we mentioned before, doing like little movie nights via Zoom with your team members or with family members or with staff, getting together for, you know, cocktailing content, or my husband's doing a coffee break where everyone brings their coffee and they have a gathering via Skype or social media or Zoom. So there are all of these different things that, yeah, we got to be innovative, and we got to, you know, kind of think outside the box right now. And we have so much technology on our hands that we can tap into that. It is all about, at the end of the day, it really comes back to, it's not necessarily the information that you give people or what you are saying, it's how you make them feel. And that's what people are going to remember. How did Kendall and the Ralts group make me feel during this time period? How did the dealership make me feel? How, did they check in, or did they just come back once we're out of this pandemic and go, buy our cars, get our product, sign up for our service? If you just do that, then you're going to be really salesy, and it's going to be really icky to the consumer. So the time is right now, and the time is when you care, you can empower others.
Awesome. Thank you, Brigitta. I know you got to jump off. Thank you so much for your time being with us today. For those of you still on the call, we do have a few more questions that we're getting, but just Brigitta has to jump off.
Thanks, guys. Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you.
So Dan Schneider, what are the processes that need to be in place in order to administer the SBA loan?
Well, one, you should better hurry, because I saw an announcement today that said they expect the small business loans to be out of money the close of business today. Assuming that Congress puts more money into the program, then if the steps don't change and they're identical to the one that is just about to be cashed out, then you'll have an 8-week period that will begin to tick once the money actually goes into your account. And when you request a loan, you can get up to 2.5 times what your average weekly payroll is for a certain time period. And right now, the initial program was set up to measure the time period from January 31st of 2019 to February 29th of 2020. And excluded from that were people, I'm not going to say this differently, excluded from that calculation was any wage to any one individual that was more than $100,000. So the first $100,000 is included in the computation of the average weekly wage, but anything that that person may have received over $100,000 was not. And 75% of that money could be spent, or at least 75% of that money to be forgivable had to be spent on payroll. You could spend another 25%, or the remaining 25%, on covered rent, covered utilities, and covered mortgage interest. And one of the things that you really want to take a look at is that you may not want to maximize the percentage of the loan that can actually be forgiven, because there may be some other things that you want to do with that cash that would make more sense to you and would help you stay viable. And as you think about that process, remember that even if you don't have 100% forgiveness, you're really getting what you're having to pay back as a loan carries a 1% interest rate over 2 years. So from a financial standpoint, it could well be worth your while to be more concerned about how are we going to use the money, and use as much as you can for payroll. But if you have other expenses that you need to use the money for, then use the money for those covered expenses, or for other purposes, knowing that it's, for all practical purposes, it's as close to free as you're ever going to get without having to pay no interest on it. So those, and right now, I think the biggest thing is that the guidelines and the regulations are changing almost on a daily basis, primarily because it was one of those where they had to pass the legislation before they knew what was in it. And in order to know what was in it, you have to remember that in our system of government, a lot of the law itself is actually written by congressional and senatorial aides, not by the people who actually voted on the approval or rejection of the legislation. And that changes on an almost daily basis. So the first thing is talk to your financial advisors, your CPAs. If you have attorneys who are involved in it, you may want to get the attorney involved too, because there may be some provisions in there that you don't really want. to be settled with. But basically, talk to your trusted advisors, your bankers, your CPAs, and your attorneys about what's going to work best and be best for you.
Great. Do you have any insight into calculating payroll for reimbursement for forgiveness?
Yes. You need to calculate the average monthly payroll. And again, the time period was initially January 31st of 2019 to February 29th of 2020. So just take a look at, you probably by now, and well, you had to run W-2 statements earlier, so you have a pretty good feel for what the last 11 months of 2019 look like, and then add in the first month of 2020. Exclude any compensation that for any individual over $100,000, and then divide that by 12, and that'll give you what your average monthly payroll is. And then you'll multiply your average monthly payroll by 2.5, 2.5, and that will give you the amount of the loan that you're eligible for. And 75% of 100% of that can be forgivable if it's all used to keep people on the payroll. And there's a separate calculation for deciding what the payroll period is for head count. So that again is where you want to talk with your CPAs, or if you're large enough to have a CFO or a director of accounting, get them involved and make sure they understand what the regulations are so that they calculate it properly. But in most cases, you're going to need some outside help, or at least some expertise in calculating what's going to be forgivable and whether or not it's worth your while to have 100% forgivable. Many people are deciding that it was not worth their while to have it be 100% forgivable because they just didn't want the strings that came with it. So.
Thank you. Amy, how do you give insight into how to redirect a leadership that has forgotten that their main purpose is to lead their people, not lead their own work or career?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's a loaded gun, quite honestly. But I think we've talked a lot about it here today in this conversation about making sure you're making it all about your employees, your family, your community. You know, you've got to really work to take yourself out of it, especially if you're leading family, leading people. You've got to put them first, and it's not mitigating or taking away from the fact that yourself is not important. It is, but there are other ways that we can take care of ourselves. But when we are responsible for others, then we have to make sure we are ever present for them and putting them first and understanding that they have needs. We've got to set expectations. We've got to clearly communicate and communicate often. We've got to work harder for that personal connection. We've talked a lot here about empathy, so we've got to be willing to go deep and empathize with everybody with what's going on. So I think the biggest takeaway is don't make it about you, make it about them, because you've got to remember at the end of the day, everybody's going to remember how we acted as leaders. And if we don't have that servant leadership mindset, then it could be a huge detriment to us when we come out of this.
Awesome. Dan, we're getting down to the end of these questions that we're getting in. Dan, this one's for you. How do we get the most out of employees that are encouraged to work from home or have to work from home, but don't work efficiently or effectively at home?
I think Amy touched on this earlier in the discussion, and I think it's important to set up clear boundaries if you're able to set up a working space, productive working space for yourself. That is, in my experience, been very helpful. That space becomes my time to lock in and work, and also allows me, as Amy said earlier, one of the challenges in working from home is feeling like you can not work at times. Like when you're done working, you've got to be able to, I think everyone's going to be able to unplug to a certain extent and recharge. And I think setting up clear boundaries and with a physical space if possible is very helpful when it comes to both being productive, locking in and working, and also knowing like, okay, I put an honest day in, and it's okay for me to spend time with my family just hanging out. And I think that's important when we're working from home, and find exercise, and also find a way to I think get some personal time in if you can. We're all in, I think, more crowded environments than what we're typically used to in one way or another. So that can be an important part of being productive from home.
Thank you. So this is another great segue. Schneider, so some people were struggling with performance before this happened, before the COVID, and they may be struggling even more now, being either isolated at home or having to work from home. So how do we talk to them about this?
One of the things that I like to do with people that are struggling with their performance is sit down and have a beer with them. And the beer, in this case, is an acronym, and the B stands, we're going to talk a little bit about your behavior on the job. So that what we're describing are not personal characteristics of the individual, we're talking about the behavior that they're showing either at work, when they're working in a corporate setting, or if they're working from home, the kinds of behaviors that may be impacting their productivity. The first E in the acronym BEER is, here is the effect of that behavior on the people who are depending on you to provide them with information or to get your piece of whatever the job is done. And you want to make sure, as Amy talked about earlier, that they really know why they have the job in the first place. So the expectation is that they perform the job that you described to them at the time that they were hired, and if you've done it correctly, that you've reinforced on an almost daily basis with them. The second E talks about expectations, and say, here are the expectations that we expect you to have, and say those so clearly that it's relatively impossible to misunderstand what the expectations are. And then the R in the BEER is to tell them what kind of review cycle, or how are we going to check on what the results are that you're actually producing. And this is when you get into the kinds of conversations on an almost daily basis with them about how are you doing? Are you clear on the expectations? Are you clear, here's how your behavior has changed, and here's, as a result of that behavior change, here's the effect that that's having on the rest of the team, so that you can talk to them a little bit about how they're contributing value to the overall organization. So, and most people know, most people don't have a problem sitting down and having a beer with somebody. So just think of it in terms of, we're just sitting down and we're sharing a brew, and here's what we're going to talk about over the beer. So
Thank you.
it can be very, very powerful when it's done.
Yeah. I think that's great, Dan. And I think on the flip side of it, I think it's normal to expect that we're going to have maybe underperformance from some of our people as they're transitioning to a different style of work environment, or the distractions at home, or the anxiety and stress. But I can't emphasize enough that if you had a poor performer or an underperformer before this took place, and that continues to play out, this is not an excuse for them to continue to underperform. And I was coaching with somebody last week on this, and that they felt that this person was an underperformer before all of this impacted the business, and now this person is performing even less, and they felt they wanted to give them a pass on their performance and potentially not consider letting them go. And this is not the time or space to use what's going on with the pandemic and this crisis as a free pass for underperformers. If anything, these are people we would hope would step up and either at least meet the expectation they had been setting before, or increasing their expectations because it's a different environment. So if that helps.
Yeah, those are good points.
Dan Schneider, so what liability and or culture concerns might we have in bringing people back to work once we have a green light from the government?
we'll talk about the liability piece first from a risk management standpoint. And I think there that you are under the OSHA guidelines. I no longer recall how large or what the threshold level is to be covered under the OSHA Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, but it's there somewhere. So part of what you've got to look at is what are the legal liabilities that you have, and probably one that may happen is if somebody comes back to work and can demonstrate that she or he contracted coronavirus as a result of their work. That probably would be true in occupations that are still working because they've been deemed essential. Then you'll have employers' comp, your workers' comp insurance will come into play there. And that's kind of a no-fault standard. Nobody's going to beat you up because that happened. But if there's a recordable case of the coronavirus and it can be demonstrated and proven that it was caused by the responsibilities that the person had at work, then you have to record that as reportable sickness or injury. From a culture standpoint, I think that one of the risks is that part of what people expect from their leaders who really shape the culture in an organization is that, first of all, the leader or the owner of the company has the employees back, part of which means that they're going to take responsibility for making sure they've got a safe and healthy workplace. So I think the cultural damage that you would suffer as a result of having people return too quickly or possibly get sick on the job probably would be greater than the financial liability that you're going to have, because that'll be covered by your workers' comp insurance. The other piece of the culture that becomes important is that it's going to become demoralizing to the people who come back and maybe don't get sick, to see other people leaving because they are sick or taking time off, and then that's going to create some trust issues, and it could have an impact on your ability to retain and or attract the kind of people that you really want working within your organization. So I think as people come back, there may be some additional precautions that you want to take to the extent that you can do social distancing and whatever kind of work it is that you're involved in. You may want to continue that for a while. One of the things I've noticed, even at grocery stores, is that now on the conveyor belt that you put your food on, at least in Iowa, they're responsible for sanitizing the conveyor belt. And one of the things I wondered is, are they going to continue to sanitize the conveyor belt once the coronavirus is over, or will we go back to the same unsanitary conditions we now feel like we had to sanitize for? So I don't really know how a lot of these things that we're doing are going to continue going forward, but they will have a cultural impact. And the key, again, is just to say, here's what we're doing, here's how we're doing it, and here's why we're doing it. And make it about the people that you're doing it with and for. And part of it goes back to what Amy was saying as far as performance was concerned. If your culture was not highly regarded by most of your employees before the coronavirus, if you don't do things differently after the coronavirus, it's probably not going to be highly regarded either. So you've got to take a look at what's really important to us. Is it consistent with what we say our values are and the way that we think people should be treated with dignity and respect, and move forward on that basis.
Thank you, Dan. So we're going to wrap it up now, and I'm going to start with Amy LeBrake. Alan, and if there was one thing that you would want to leave the audience with today, what would that be?
I think that the common theme that we're all going through right now is we are all in this together. There's not one piece of ourselves or community or workplace environment that doesn't have some sort of stress, anxiety, or fear on us. And for whatever reason it might be, we all have it. So I think it's remembering we're all in this together. And as leaders, those of us that are leading family, leading self, and leading others is to remember to employ empathy. We've got to be as empathetic as we've ever been. We've really got to work on that personal connection and really engaging and communicating and being present. Ever present, I think, is one of the biggest things. And I know at Rawls Group, it's a big theme, but as I said earlier, it's like servant leadership. The best thing we can do is lead by example. And be servant leaders to our community, to our families, to our employees. You know, I think that's probably one of the most important things today.
Thank you. Dan Iosu?
I would, I would emphasize being versatile, versatility in looking for the opportunities that exist and looking for the positives in the change that we're going through. Like there's always change under relatively quote unquote normal circumstances. Now we're under, of course, intense, dramatically forced change. So look for the opportunity in it and embrace it. It might really suck at times, but embrace the suck, embrace the challenge. As Lloyd Rawls, our founding partner, would say, put your knife between your teeth and get after it.
Awesome, thank you. Dan Schneider.
Well, we haven't said it quite this way, but I think one of the most important things to remember is, I know because I run early in the morning that the sun came up in the east this morning, and I feel relatively certain, based on the way it's moving across the sky, that it's probably going to set in the west, and I expect the same thing will happen tomorrow. So life is, and if it doesn't, then we've got bigger problems than the coronavirus that we're going to have to deal with. So the key here is focus on what you can control, live to the extent that you can in day-tight compartments so that you're only focused on one day at a time, and think about the kinds of choices and decisions that you're making, because they impact how you're going to respond to the situations that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So know that in all probability, the sun will come up in the east tomorrow, and we'll get to try this again.
Thank you. Yeah, diamonds are made in the rough, and butterflies are transitioned and cocooned by immense change and pressure, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for us in the future for versatile, flexible, have empathy, and know that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. Thank you.
I think there's a Broadway musical about that. Annie talks about the sun will come up tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'm not going to sing it for the people that are on the group. I would not do that.
Well, thank you so much to our expert panelists. Thank you to those who called in and submitted your questions. Without your questions, your participation, this conversation would not have been as rich. So thank you so much for participating. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me or any of the expert panelists. We're here to serve you and want to do anything that we can to help each other out. So thanks so much, and I hope you have a great rest of the day and week.
Thanks, Kendall.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kendall.